Ronald Reagan ruined everything. Ronald Reagan, the 40th President of the United States, is hailed as a champion of conservative ideals, a figurehead of an era that was defined by tax cuts, deregulation, and a belief in the power of the free market. To many, his presidency is remembered for reshaping the country's political landscape, restoring American pride, and ending the Cold War. Beneath that shiny rhetoric, behind the grand speeches, there's another side of Ronald Reagan's legacy, one that's far less discussed, but just as important to understand. A side that left lasting scars on some of this nation's most vulnerable communities. While Reagan's policies may have revitalized certain sectors of the economy, also dismantled critical social services that many Americans depend on, from the poor to the elderly, from families to children. Reagan's administration took bold steps to limit government intervention and reduce the quote-unquote welfare state. Who paid the price for all those cuts? Who was left behind when the government that once supported and provided a safety net was pulled away? In this episode, we'll take a deep dive into 10 social services that were left in ruins under the Reagan administration. We'll look at how programs like welfare, food assistance, housing, mental health care, and public education were slashed and what it means for people who depend on them. I'm not here to paint a simple picture of good or bad. Reagan's presidency, like any other presidency in any political era, is complex and multifaceted. But it is important to acknowledge that there was harm done significantly during his presidency. Ronald Reagan was not a president who saved America. It's the story of a president who broke the safety net that was supposed to help the most vulnerable people in need. However, the effects of these policies often led to reduced access to crucial social services, resulting in an increased hardship for marginalized communities. Let's start off with welfare assistance, specifically aid to families with dependent children. Reagan significantly reduced funding for welfare programs, including the Aid for Families of Dependent Children, also known as AFDC, which provided financial assistance to low-income families with children. The administration imposed stringent eligibility requirements, making it more difficult for families to qualify. Block grants were also introduced, which reduced federal spending and shifted the responsibility to state governments. Reagan's ideological belief in welfare reform was grounded in the idea that welfare programs created dependency and discouraged work. He emphasized personal responsibility and sought to reduce federal spending by limiting government programs. Reagan's ideological belief in welfare reform was grounded in the idea that welfare programs created dependency and discouraged work. He emphasized personal responsibility and sought to reduce federal spending by limiting entitlement programs. Now, he calls all of these things entitlement programs, so I'm going to use that word a lot. Also, food stamps, known as the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP. Reagan viewed food stamps as part of a larger welfare system that he sought to cut. He argued that the system was inefficient and prone to fraud. His policies pushed for a decrease in government spending on entitlement programs. The people that were affected were low-income people and families, especially children, elderly people, and people with disabilities. People suffered from reduced access to food assistance, leading to an increase in food insecurity. Also, mental health. Reagan's policies led to a massive reduction in federal funding for mental health services. His administration continued the process of deinstitutionalization that began in the 60s, closing many mental health institutions without providing adequate community-based care. Funding for community mental health services was also slashed. Reagan believed that mental health care should be provided by private sectors and community organizations rather than through state-funded mental health facilities. He emphasized reducing federal government spending, which led to cuts in services. Individuals with mental illness, especially the homeless and those with severe mental health conditions, were left without treatment. The deinstitutionalization process, combined with lack of proper community support, led to an explosion in homelessness. Public education. Reagan proposed cuts to the Department of Education, arguing that local governments should take a stronger role in funding and managing schools. He also opposed the expansion of the federal programs like Title I, which provided financial aid to disadvantaged schools, and sought to end bilingual education programs. Again, Reagan did this because he believed in limited government. Reagan believed in limited federal involvement in education, arguing that local governments and private institutions should better serve the needs of students. He aimed to reduce the federal spending on education, viewing it as a state and local responsibility. Low-income students, children of color, and students in underfunded schools suffered the most from these cuts. Minority groups and students with disabilities experienced worse education outcomes as funding for special education and minority-focused programs dwindled. All of these programs affected Black and brown people. I find it ironic that Ronald Reagan pushed all of these programs to the side and cut their funding, especially the ones for the people that didn't vote for him. Healthcare in general, specifically Medicaid and Medicare. Reagan made significant cuts to Medicaid and Medicare, reducing benefits and limiting eligibility. His administration also capped federal funding for state Medicaid programs, leading to disparities in health access across states. Reagan believed that the federal government was too involved in healthcare, and his goal was to reduce the budget deficit. He argued that private insurance and market competition would provide better healthcare options. Look where that's gotten us today. Low-income individuals, people who couldn't afford healthcare, the elderly, and people with disabilities and children were hit the hardest. Low-income individuals, people who couldn't afford healthcare, people who couldn't afford healthcare, like low-income individuals, the elderly, people with disabilities, and children were hardest hit. Many were unable to access necessary medical treatments due to reduced benefits and increased costs. Unemployment insurance. Reagan pushed for cuts to unemployment benefits and worked to limit the duration of assistance. He also implemented stricter eligibility requirements for unemployment insurance, making it harder for people to qualify. Reagan believed that a free market economy should drive employment and that long-term unemployment benefits created dependency. His administration sought to reduce government spending on unemployment insurance as part of its broader fiscal conservatism plan. Reagan believed that the free market economy should drive employment and that long-term unemployment benefits created dependency. His administration sought to reduce government spending on unemployment insurance as part of its broader fiscal conservative plan. Unemployed workers, especially those laid off during the early 80s recession, faced longer periods without financial support. This led to increased poverty and economic hardships for millions of American workers. Veterans benefits. Reagan reduced funding for the Veterans Healthcare and Benefits Administration, including cuts to the VA. Reagan reduced funding for Veterans Healthcare and Benefits, including cuts to the Veterans Administration. He also attempted to privatize certain services which led to diminished quality of care. Reagan believed that veteran services should be streamlined and managed more efficiently, often through private contractors rather than being provided directly by the government. Veterans, particularly those with disabilities or mental health issues like PTSD, were affected the most. Many veterans found it more difficult to access the care that they needed, and some faced bureaucratic barriers to receiving benefits. Social Security. Although Reagan did not dismantle Social Security, his administration cut other social safety net programs that affected its recipients. He also agreed to raise the retirement age and reduce cost of living adjustments for Social Security recipients. Again, Reagan prioritized deficit reduction and sought to make the federal budget more sustainable, which led to cuts and reforms to entitlement, quote-unquote, programs. Social Security, while not directly cut, face reduced benefits over time due to inflation and rising costs. The elderly and individuals who relied on Social Security for income found their benefits eroded by inflation and changes in the system. These individuals were already among the most economically vulnerable in society. Child nutrition programs. Reagan's administration attempted to cut funding from children's nutrition programs and famously referred to ketchup as a, quote, vegetable to justify cuts to school lunch standards. Funding for nutritional programs like the National School Lunch Program were also reduced. Reagan viewed school nutrition as a local responsibility and aimed to cut federal spending, even when it came to programs designed to ensure children had access to nutritious meals. Children from low-income families were most affected by these cuts, as school lunch programs were a key source of daily nutrition for many children. The lack of healthy meals exacerbated food insecurity. The policies that I read off today are a reflection of Ronald Reagan's broader philosophy of reducing government intervention and cutting spending on social service programs. However, the consequences were severe for a lot of Americans, specifically if you were black or if you were brown in this country or low income. The consequences were so severe for most vulnerable populations that they have lasting effects till this day. If you like what I had to say, please don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Also, if you want to buy merch like my Ban Bigots Not Books t-shirt, the link is in the bio at the merch store. The link is in the description below. I hope you learned something new today, and thanks again for watching.